Okay, I think we'll get started and let any latecomers straggle in while I give my intro. So welcome to the Science Fiction TV Dinner Series, everyone. I'm Joey Eschrick, and I work at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University, and I'll be your host today. In 2020 and into this year, we've shifted gears on this Science Fiction TV Dinner Series. We're hosting these events virtually to help keep our community safe during the ongoing pandemic crisis. And instead of TV series, we're featuring short films by talented creators that invite us to explore a range of possible visions of the future. And this is the last TV dinner event for the 2020/2021 academic year. We'll take a little bit of time off for the summer, and we'll see how things go. We'll be back with events in some form, either virtual or in person or in some sort of hybrid form next fall. We'll be doing a little bit over the summer. I'll talk about that later, but we're really going to pick back up with these TV dinner events starting in maybe September or October, I hope. So this evening, we're going to watch and discuss The Mailbox, which is a short science fiction film about time travel and Chinatowns and very much more. And it's directed by Louis Yin, who we're lucky to have with us from Shanghai, where it's already tomorrow morning. So a tiny little bit of time travel there too. Hi, Louis.
Hello.
So I'm going to introduce each of our speakers real quick. So Louis received his MFA in filmmaking from New York University, and he studied political science and economics at Bates College. He's made short films and documentaries in Asia, North America, Europe, and Africa, including The Mailbox, which was shortlisted for the Golden Goblet Award at the Shanghai International Film Festival. He recently shot his first feature film, As Day Comes and Goes, which was accepted into the work in progress section of the 2021 Hong Kong International Film Festival. And his feature in development, which is titled The Boy from Manchuria, was accepted into the development labs at the Shanghai Film Festival, at the First International Film Festival, and the China Film Director Guild's Young Director Support Program. So thank you so much for being here. We're also really delighted and so excited to have Dr. Diane Wong with us. Hi, Diane. Diane is an assistant professor of political science at Rutgers University, Newark. Her interests include American politics, Asian American politics, critical race studies, gender and sexuality, comparative immigration, urban displacement, and community-rooted research. As a first-generation Chinese American born and raised in Flushing, Queens in New York City, her research is intimately tied to the Asian diaspora and urban immigrant experience. Her book project, which is titled You Can't Evict a Movement, focuses on intergenerational resistance to gentrification in Manhattan Chinatown. As a socially engaged artist, she works closely with the WOW Project and the Chinatown Art Brigade. So thank you so much to both of you. And I'm going to talk for a little bit more, and then we're going to get to the screening. So a few quick programming notes for everyone. First, Corey Pressman, just like with our previous TV events, Corey Pressman, who's a member of our Imaginary College at the Center, has created another feature-filmed cuisine segment for this event as a way to pay homage to the food that we would have normally provided you if we were having this event in person. We miss you all. So I hope you'll check out his video, which is about fermented foods of the future. And I'm going to drop a link in the Zoom chat here. And if you registered for the event, which all of you probably did, you should have received that link in an email beforehand. So the email you got an hour ago and then a day ago, we'll have that link in it as well. And second, in a moment here, we're going to start by screening The Mailbox, which is about 18 minutes in length. Some folks can have trouble with Zoom streaming video. We've had really good luck so far, but things can happen. If you registered, you should have received an email with a link and password to screen the film, and that link will work until this Friday, April 30th, if you want to watch it after the event. And I'm going to drop another link in chat for everyone. If something bad happens during the event and Zoom isn't treating you right, you can actually watch alongside in a browser or again, check it out afterwards. But things have worked well. And as we've tested for this event, things have seemed to be pretty good on the internet side. So fingers crossed, everyone. And then third, we're able to share this film during the event and for viewing after because of the support and collaboration of Storycom. Storycom is the first professional story commercialization agency in China, and it's dedicated to bringing excellent Chinese speculative fiction stories to domestic and global audiences. Storycom also presents the Shimmer program to introduce new audiences to Chinese speculative fiction. And so you can learn more by following them on Twitter at the Shimmer program, or excuse me, just Shimmer program. And I will drop a link at the end of the event to that. But I would recommend you check them out and read Chinese science fiction. It's really, really good. There's a lot of amazing stuff coming out from China and starting to be translated more and more. So I definitely commend it to you. After the screening, Diane, Louis, and I are going to have a conversation for maybe about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll shift to taking questions and comments from all of you. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and you can use that to submit your questions and thoughts. And you can do that anytime. You can do it during the event. You can do it at the very end, but you don't have to wait. So if something occurs to you, please just go ahead and do that. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you all so much again for being with us here tonight and for supporting our work at the Center for Science and the Imagination. We just couldn't do it without you, and it's been a tricky year and a tricky new 2021, but we are so glad to have everyone's support and participation. So we hope you enjoy the show.
Mr. Meyer, I have nothing more. I have give you all I have.
Have you?
Where the fuck is it?
All right, welcome back, everyone. We already have some questions coming in, which is great. So keep those coming. We're going to have a good amount of time for those after I ask some of my own questions to Louis and Diane. So Louis, we'll start with you. I just, it sounds like, so from talking to you a bit before the event, this was a unique project for you compared to some of your other output because you didn't write it, and you tend to write your own films. So where did the story come from, and how did you approach the process of adapting it?
Sure. So this Chinese sci-fi production company called Storycom bought the copyright of a short story. And when they approached me to direct the film, they already had like 4 or 5 directors before, because the challenge was how to develop the story. The original short story has a long time span and a lot of events without a clear drama, so it was hard to develop. And also it was all set in London with all white characters. So also it was clearly a genre film, and I was in like my 2nd year of grad school. I hadn't done anything like it, but they have a pretty decent budget with $70,000, and the biggest film I did by then was like $7,000, so I couldn't say no. Yeah, so for me, the first thing I wanted to do was change the setting. So you know, I thought I was Chinese. I'm Chinese. The investors are Chinese. You know, why don't we make it a Chinese story instead of like a London, like a white story? And also because there are so few Chinese sci-fi films, and you know, we don't really see Asian or Chinese faces in sci-fi films. So yeah, so also I knew I have to shoot it in New York, so I thought it was a good idea to just set it in the New York Chinatown. In that way, I can be more related. Yeah. Also, so I had a friend from NYU writing department. We started, you know, write together on this, adapt together on this story. And so basically the way we dramatized the story was to come up with this essential prop, the necklace. It seems easy, but we actually spent a lot of time thinking about it. Because we have 4 main characters, we have 2 families, we have 2 time periods. So we need something to connect all these elements together. And I think the necklace worked. Yeah, so and when we thought about this, things became easier. But I have to say that the central idea of this film, to me, feels a bit old. The mailbox that can time travel. There are a lot of films that had the same concept. And also, I didn't have too much time learning about the genre, like sci-fi or action. So I think this end product is okay. I'm proud that I did it. But in terms of the shot, the visuals, the VFX, if I do it again now, I would make it, I guess, more stylish and more intense. Yeah.
Thank you for all that. And people have followed up with some questions that we'll get to later about production. So hopefully we'll dig into that a bit more. So, I mean, you said it was, in some ways you felt like there was some challenges with the story and things like that. But when I first talked to our friends at Storycom, and we have a friend there who's a great science fiction writer, Regina Kanye Wong, and when I talked to her, what interested me most about this film is exactly that change in setting and characters, that it centers an urban Asian American community. It focuses on a family with immigrant roots, and it sets it specifically in a Chinatown. I kind of want to address this question to both of you, but Diane, I'd love to hear from you first. Why are there so few stories about the future that focus on Asian Americans and on Asian immigrant communities around the world more broadly?
Yeah, that was really wonderful, despite this being like my third or fourth time watching.
I know, same. Yeah.
Film.
We like it, Louis.
Yes, I keep picking up on different small details, which I love when that happens. But that's such an interesting question, and something I think about a lot. Why are there so few stories about Asian American futures, and how do we imagine Asian Americans in the future, right? And I think we struggle with this question because Asian Americans are still very much perceived in the Western consciousness as the other, right? As the perpetual foreigner. And so in movies and in visual culture, in sci-fi, right, about the future, white people are often portrayed as humans, right? Humankind, whereas Asians are often portrayed either as like machine-like, robotic, and somewhat just passive in the storyline. And so I think this characterization of Asians as robotic is entangled with what scholars like Greta New has called techno-orientalism, right? So like the practice of essentially dehumanizing and ascribing relationships between technology and Asian peoples, in particular East Asians, right? And so we can think of like the Dr. Fu Manchu as an example, right? This evil masterminded persona who's featured in a lot of the 20th century's films and shows as sort of like a more vintage example of what techno-orientalism looks like when it's portrayed in films. And so what is it, how do we even begin to think about an Asian American future when Asian Americans have been so consistently portrayed as non-existent or as robots, as machine-like in the future? And so I think it requires a test of imagination. And I look to Afrofuturist thinkers and artists, right, like Alondra Nelson, who speaks to speculative futures that offer a powerful vision of new ways of being that are built on, radical concepts of justice and of freedom, right? I also look towards groups like the Black Quantum Futurism Collective, which explores the intersections of futurism, of creative media, DIY aesthetics, and activism through alternative temporal lens, right? Like I find all of that to be so fascinating and relevant to this conversation we're having about Asian American futures. I also look towards critical disability scholars, right? Like Alice Wong, Leah Lakshmi, Sammy Schultz, who've challenged the ways in which ideas about the future have been used against disabled people, and the need for all of us to sort of just radically reimagine and envision futures that support multiple ways of existing, of being, and allows us to see people of color, disabled people, queer people, trans people in the future. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I'm also we've been thinking a lot about Afrofuturism over the past several years, and the Black Quantum Futures group, and yeah, it's all very on point, I think, and even just speaking to that power of like just putting people in frame who are normally out of frame when you imagine the future. And I don't know how powerful that device of framing in or framing out people can be. Louis, do you have anything to add about the sort of visibility of people from East Asia, Asian Americans, Asian immigrant communities in these visions of the future and sort of science fictional texts?
Sure. So I mean, well, I'm not an expert like Diane, but I think not only science fiction, right? Even like just films, like American films, we see kind of very few like Asian or Chinese characters. Well, I mean, I guess first of all, I mean, I lived in the US for 7 years. I studied for 7 years, and I felt like, you know, like Asian culture still seems pretty distant, you know, and even alien in the US. And compared to, I guess, other non-white cultures like African American culture or like Hispanic culture, I guess it has to do something with history and with the small Asian population. But also, you know, if we talk about, you know, the presentation of minorities and Asians in films, I mean, we're essentially talking about sci-fi. You know, when we think about sci-fi, we think of Spielberg, James Cameron, Christopher Nolan. You know, they're from the West, and of course, they write Western stories. They feature white and now some African American faces, and I don't think they're to be blamed. You know, to make sci-fi, we need money. We need big studios. And in China, in the past, we simply didn't have these to do it. And we don't really have any sci-fi films. And now, only in the recent years, we start having money and the technology to do it. Actually, we do have a few sci-fi blockbusters like The Wandering Earth in 2019. But I think for that film, the story is a bit, well, has some problems. And well, I think we need more filmmakers with modern values, and we need more simply Asian sci-fi films so that people can get used to them, I guess.
So that actually, I want to ask a question I was hoping to get to at some point, but it seems really appropriate. So, you know, so many Chinese filmmakers who've achieved international acclaim and had some success in the West, what we associate them with is these like big historical epics. So Ang Lee does Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Zhang Yimou, who has a new recent movie out, the name escapes me, but he did Hero and the Great Wall, House of Flying Daggers. And even John Woo, who most people associate with contemporary crime films, has made a bunch of historical epics since Red Cliff in 2008. So I guess like, and I would love to hear from both of you, but Louis is someone who's in the film industry. Why do we know of so few Chinese filmmakers here in the US and the West? And like, why is there such a focus on these Asian pasts instead of perhaps more futures for the continent and for Asian people in the diaspora?
Sure. So, well, these are, I guess, two questions.
It's a bunch of questions. That's what I do.
Why do we know kind of so few Chinese filmmakers here in the US? Well, I think the reason is twofold. First of all, as I said, I think you know, Chinese culture or East Asian culture is still unfamiliar to a lot of Americans and a lot of Western audience. You know, a lot of people, they're just not interested in seeing a Chinese story. Well, I think it's a pity because, you know, other than the directors, the great directors you mentioned, there are other directors like Wong Kar-wai, Ho Xiaoxian, Edward Yang. They're all great filmmakers and masters, and their films are pretty amazing. And the second reason, also quite important, is you know, sadly, I think China doesn't have that many great films, you know, with a universal value. Well, we did have a few, you know, in the 90s, we had two great films. that achieved international acclaim. You know, Zhang Yimou's To Live and Chen Kaige's Farewell, My Concubine. So, and interestingly, these films they were written by the same screenwriter called Louis, who is actually a pretty unique writer in China in that he understands genre films. He has very modern values. That short, I mean, there are too few Chinese films are like that, you know, and especially now, you know, for example, like Zhang Yimou's newer films like Great Wall, or you know, his films in 2011, The Flowers of War. That's a good example of why, you know, I think there's something to do with the story and the values behind it. You know, the Flower of War is like they had a pretty big budget. They wanted to do it international, like co-production. They have Christian Bale. You know, they were aiming for an international hit and everything, but they failed pretty miserably. And why? Because I think the problem is with the story and with the values behind it. Because, you know, the story happens in World War II. You know, during the Japanese occupation in China. And so basically they have this mission to rescue these Chinese female students who are about to be raped by the Japanese soldiers. And how do they do it? They use a few Chinese prostitutes to replace those students so that the prostitutes can be raped, not the students. You know, it's really, you know, to me and to a lot of audience, it's strange, you know, like why are the prostitutes' life unworthy, you know, compared to those of the students? You know, so this value thing it's an old-fashioned kind of stereotypical Chinese value, I guess. But you know, that's only an example, but that's actually the problem with a lot of Chinese films, with their, you know, the values behind them. They're not universal. They're but I think things are changing, you know, with directors like Bong Joon-ho, he's Korean, An Lee and Chloe Zhao, who just won the Oscar. I hope more audience would be willing to watch Asian films. Yeah, and to your second question, I mean, like, why, you know, there's a fixation on Asian past and not future. I kind of answered in the previous question, I guess. I think, well, I mean, yeah, first, I guess it has to do with history. You know, I guess China has, like, we say we have 5,000 years of history. I guess when we, so we have a lot of historical dramas to tell, but also, as I said, to make sci-fi is really hard. You know, you need money, you need technology, and only in recent years that we have these, we have the ability to make sci-fi films. So I hope we can make more, and we can let the world see, you know, Asian sci-fi films. And then I do want to mention a Chinese sci-fi writer called Liu Cixin. His book Three Body Trilogy achieved international acclaim. It's a pretty amazing book. Although its female characters are a bit questionable, but still it's a great novel.
So Diane, I want to talk specifically about Chinatowns, but I wanted to see if you had anything to say about this kind of you know, global prevalence of visions of the deep past.
Yeah, I feel like Louis covered a lot of what I was thinking. But I don't know, I guess obviously I don't watch as much sci-fi. But when I do, I'm always just intrigued about why Asia, right, as you asked, is always sort of like a contested site of either like hyper-modernity or stuck in the past, right? Yeah. But regardless, whichever one, either of these scenarios, of these imaginations, it ends up dehumanizing and othering, right, Asian peoples across time. And so I think it speaks to what I said earlier about just how Asians, and if we're talking about, you know, Liz's film, Asian Americans in particular, have been racialized and situated in the global context. But I also think that part of it has to do with the lack of platforms to tell these stories, which is why I think it's so important for Asian writers, storytellers, producers, directors to be able to create their own spaces and platforms to tell the stories about the futures that they want to see.
Thank you both for those answers. That's, yeah, we could talk about just that question for the entire time. But one of the things, I mean, it's been such a great pleasure to watch this film like 5 times, but also because of its sighting in Chinatown, it led me to finding Diane and getting connected with her. And that's been really great and really educational. So I wanted to ask you, Diane, about, especially with reference to the way this film works representationally, like how are people viewing Chinatowns? I think that, as we were just talking about with films, there's this tendency of like the architecture and the aesthetic that's presented to tourists and visitors that evokes a kind of like mythologized and flattened, generalized Asian past. What should people be thinking when they visit Chinatowns, and how does this film help you look at them, maybe, or help folks look at them differently?
Yeah, so I mean, there is a tendency for people to view Chinatowns as like a tourist destination, right? A place where you can just go eat dim sum or just buy gifts and things like that. But I think just digging deeper, I think we really need to think about the reason why Chinatowns were created in the first place, which is political, right? Chinatowns were created because of anti-Chinese discrimination and legal barriers that prevented access to resources and formal political institutions. And so in order to survive, Chinese people formed networks in what we know now as Chinatowns to provide mutual aid, social services, and support for one another. And so I think the spatial construction of Chinatowns, right, has always been deeply entangled with narratives that has normalized racial exclusion and enforced enclosure, right? If you look on a map, Chinatown always has specific boundaries drawn around it, right? You can sometimes tell with markers like the pagoda, the gate, the dragon. And so as you describe, right, the architecture and the aesthetic of Chinatowns presented to tourists, right, often seems to enclose these neighborhoods within certain spatial boundaries. And it seems to root them in the past just by looking the kind of architecture that we're seeing, right? So Chinatowns like the one in San Francisco have architecturally been designed, right, to maintain this exotic aesthetic where, you know, to attract tourists with bright colors, with pagodas, dragons, right, randomly arching across the neighborhood, and ornamental designs, right? This is sort of what architect and historian Philip Choi calls an ethnic Disneyland, right? It's all for show. And so this aesthetic plays into Western fantasies of Chinatowns, right, as just forever being foreign, and as a timeless place that is never changing. But I think the reality is what we're seeing is that these Chinatowns are facing tremendous changes behind closed doors, right? Things that happen like displacement and evictions are not as easily discernible to the eye, right? You can't really tell what's happening inside of buildings. And so I think, you know, you asked what people should be attentive of when they're visiting these communities. I think it's really important to understand just how Chinatowns are changing and shifting due to gentrification, right? And the kinds of changes that are affecting the neighborhood, right, due to things like evictions, landlord harassment. And so as Chinatowns across the country continues to change and networks and families are dispersed due to gentrification, I think it's really important that we pay attention to how existing residents living in these Chinatowns are fighting to stay.
Yeah. Well, one thing I really liked about that I really like about the Mailbox and the way that Louis and his collaborators adapted it is that I think it is attentive to issues of class. I mean, it sort of shows economic stress on the screen, and I think often with any you know, immigrant population, urban immigrant population in the U.S., we have a bad tendency to represent those as a monolithic, right? Everyone in this neighborhood is impoverished. Everybody in this neighborhood is doing really well. And I think that just showing folks who are working class and then folks who are having a change because of the plot of the film in their class status and position, and showing that families situation changing, just helps draw our attention to the fact that there are all these socioeconomic issues that are playing out in spaces that we think of as, just like you said, that's a really apt phrase, that ethnic Disneylands, just for people to visit. Like, you forget that people live there. I think they're designed in a way to kind of camouflage, like you said, the population that actually calls that home. So you do all this community rooted research, you do work that's artistic and creative. What kinds of visions of the future do folks who call these Chinatowns home have for themselves, or what kinds of visions of the future are possible or available? Especially, it seems in talking to you that the pandemic has sort of sped up and intensified some of these forces around people being forced out and problems with real estate and space and land.
Yeah, so, well, my research focuses on intergenerational resistance to gentrification happening in Chinatowns, and specifically in New York City. I guess for clarification, right, it could be useful to define the word gentrification. And so whenever I'm using it in my work, it's a working definition, but I'm primarily talking about a form of violence, a systemic and intentional process of uprooting communities from their homes, right? So at the most basic level, gentrification is displacement, which comes along with unequal power relations. And so in Chinatown, specifically, gentrification has brought a lot of shifts in culture and how people relate to the space at the block level, where we're seeing, in New York at least, we're seeing a lot more artists, galleries that have been opened up in the neighborhood in the last 5 years or so. I think in the last map that Liz Moy from the Chinatown Art Brigade created, there were over 160 white box art galleries, right, in clusters. And so I think it's really important just to think about these kind of changes and how these material conditions have been compounded by the effects of the pandemic, right? Leaving vulnerable small businesses that are often immigrant owned and families even more at risk of eviction, of losing their homes. And so, like, is it possible to envision a future for Chinatown that is resilient, right, and is sustainable, one that exists without dispossession? And I think the answer is yes, right? People are already fighting and organizing at the ground level. And so I think that we can look towards the work that activists are doing to imagine different futures for Chinatown. So thinking about groups like the Chinatown Art Brigade, which I'm active with, an intergenerational collective that uses arts activism to combat the kinds of changes that we're seeing in the neighborhood. CAB organizing Asian communities and their Chinatown Tenants Union as well. There's a Chinatown Community for Equitable Development in Los Angeles, Chinatown, and a number of other organizations that are doing this kind of placekeeping work, right? That help us to reimagine our relationship to cities that unsettle logics of racial capitalism that pushes gentrification, right? And so I would definitely I can drop the links to some of these orgs in the chat if it's helpful.
That would be great, yeah. So let's see. Well, so one thing, and we're gonna, in about, I don't know, 6 or 7 minutes, we'll shift over to, we have a bunch of great questions. So I wanna make sure that we leave time for those. I'm bad about that. Louis, what advice would you share with young filmmakers, especially folks from Asian backgrounds or Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders here in the US, about how to get started doing this work and getting new stories out there in film? Like, I know you spent a lot of time in New York in school and making films here, and then you've done so internationally. So do you have a few starting points or ideas you might share?
Sure. Well, first of all, I consider myself a young filmmaker, so I could
younger filmmakers, the youngest filmmakers among our audience.
Yeah. So I could only talk from my experience. Well, for me, I went to film school. I think going to a film is a good option, but it's quite expensive. Its advantage is that you learn systematically about everything about filmmaking, and also quite important is that it gives you this creative atmosphere. You're among filmmakers like you for 3 years. You learn from each other. You compete with each other. So basically, you're in this vibe to just create, to think, and to work hard. But I think even without going to film school, I think it's not difficult to just write something and go ahead and shoot it with a very small budget. I would say for me that's the most important thing. Who for anyone I think who has the ambition to make a movie, we gotta start making films. So for me, in NYU, we were required to make 3 films, but I ended up making 6. And even before going to grad school, I made like 4 short films in college. They're all very terrible films, but I definitely learned a lot from making mistakes and thinking about, I guess, how to make something better. And as for filmmakers from an Asian background, how to get Asian stories out there, to be honest, I think different people have different answers, and I don't think it's easy. Well, for me, I knew very clear before I graduated that I would go back to China because the few stories I had in mind, they're all Chinese stories. But and then I started applying for the fund of like in China we have something like Sundance, like there are film festivals that support your scripts and so that you can submit. And then if you're accepted, they give you the chance to connect with bigger investors. But that's only one option. And I mean, if we look at the filmmakers in the US, Asian filmmakers in the US, like An Li, Chloe Zhao, well, there's also their approach are quite different too. An Li, he made his first 2 films, his first 2 feature films with the funding from Taiwan, government funding from Taiwan. He made films about like the conflict between Chinese culture and American culture. And Chloe Zhao is different. She just dives into the West. She doesn't really make Asian films, but she is visible as an Asian director. So basically, I think there's no formula. There's a cliche saying in film school, find your own voice. I think it's very true. I think we have to think about what's a unique story we can tell and how do we tell it. In the US now, we have so many films about minority culture, minority conflicts. But to be honest, I think very few of them are unique and interesting. So how do we make a good film, a memorable film? I think that's every filmmaker has to work very hard on it.
So I really, as I keep saying, want to shift to the questions from the audience, but I want to ask a kind of parallel question to Diane really quickly before we do that. So Diane, kind of trailing on the answers that you gave a moment ago, like what advice would you share with anyone who wants to learn more about Chinatowns and how to support Chinatowns all over the US that have been so severely affected in the wake of the pandemic or the ongoing pandemic, really, of course, and the anti-Asian violence that, I mean, we're finally starting to pay attention to now?
Yeah, I think, I mean, because of the anti-Asian violence, right, and xenophobia that started before, COVID really hit the US. Chinatowns have been sort of recently written about in the media and in conversations as places of just anger, curiosity, or sympathy. And I think it's just as a point of intervention, I would advise those who are looking to learn more about Chinatowns and finding ways to support to just learn more and find ways to uplift existing organizations that are working within these neighborhoods. There's a long history of just collective resilience and mutual aid in Chinatowns across the country. And so, there are various grassroots organizations that have been doing a lot of work to distribute aid, resources, different kinds of support for community members, right? So in New York, organizations like CAB, Organizing Asian Communities, an organization that was initially founded to combat anti-Asian violence, and then expanded to combat violence in all forms, ranging from like evictions to police brutality, labor rights for sex workers, street vendors, right, domestic workers. And so given just these changes and the impact that gentrification and the pandemic and anti-Asian violence has had on the neighborhood, I think it'd be really useful just to find ways to get plugged in and just be mindful with how you're interacting with the space next time you visit and see these changes.
Yeah. So I'm gonna start our questions from the audience with a kind of rapid fire series for you, Louis. If you'll, a bunch of people ask questions kind of about production of the film, which I usually will ask more about up front, but we had so much to talk about. So these are from Flory and Nicholas and Rebecca. So thank you all. So first, like, when did you shoot the movie? What year were you shooting in? Was it, I think maybe, I feel like it was released in 2018, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, I think we shot in 2017. Yeah.
Okay. So were you living in New York at the time?
Yeah. I was in my second year of grad school in NYU. I was in New York. Yeah.
Okay. And then where specifically did you film? Like, what is Nicholas is wondering where? Yeah,
so we have two main locations. The first, the alley and that area is in the real Chinatown.
Yeah.
And we were looking for something, sketchy. yeah, that was a word. Yeah, so and we found this amazing place. So like you go down. Like you go downstairs and you see this amazing alley, and actually that's an area for like to play mahjong. Like when we did the location scouting, there were like a dozen like old people just playing mahjong. It was very, very Chinese. Yeah, and the other location is in Brooklyn. Like it's a small, it's just a typical Brooklyn apartment.
And how long was the shoot?
We shot for 5 days and then we reshot for a day. So 6 days in total.
Pretty fast. Okay. And then Rebecca, I didn't catch this in the credits either. I know I keep forgetting to do it, but Rebecca says she loved the hip hop song at the end. I really like it too. Who's the artist?
So I'll type in here. It's called Bohan Phoenix.
Please do. Yeah, put it in the chat you can put panelists and attendees so everyone can see it.
Bohan Phoenix. Yeah, he's a friend of the producer, and yeah, I love that song too. So
a few comments. So Roger says what he liked about the Mailbox is that it doesn't depend on expensive effects and gadgets. And he says, like the Russian film Stalker, which I think is an Andrei Tarkovsky film. I really like that one. I hope I've got the director right. In fact, the Mailbox is super retro, Roger goes on. A mailbox, I love it. Paper, notes written in pencil and blood. I think stories of this kind make sci-fi productions more accessible to all artists, including, of course, artists of Asian descent. So I wonder if either of you have thoughts about that. I am a big fan of kind of lo-fi and near future stories. That's often what we're doing at our center, is not, telling stories about the year 3000 or space operas, but stories that are more about putting technology into conversation or putting a science fictional concept into conversation with real lived experiences and social structure. I don't know if either of you have a thought or response to Roger's comment.
Yeah, so well for us, again, the reality was we didn't have too much budget for VFX because VFX is very expensive. And well, I guess a good thing about it is it forces you then to think creatively. How do you make the story more engaging, more imaginative, and how do you achieve some effects without doing a visual effects, but by doing like a special effect or doing something creatively to make it cheap. Yeah. Yeah. So I think I guess sci-fi. Well, I mean, it's great if you have amazing visual effects, but if you don't, I guess we're forced to think creatively.
So jumping to a question for Diane, and And this is from Quinn. I don't know if I have that pronunciation right, but that was my shot at it. Sorry if I messed that up. Diane, have you looked at the Vietnamese communities in the US, like little Saigons, as a comparison to Chinatowns?
I haven't, but I have, read a lot about folks who've been doing this work, a lot of urban studies scholars who've written about, Little Saigon. But I have been following some of the organizing work that, groups in Little Saigons, Little Tokyos have been mobilizing around when it comes to questions of displacement, right? And so I think there are a lot of interconnections. There are, I think, a lot of these just neighborhoods are connected in ways that, it's not as discernible to us. And so I think it'd be really interesting to look at sort of the connections, networks, as well as different kinds of changes that are happening. But I haven't. I'm happy to drop, links to books, to scholars who have written about this topic.
So let's see. We have time for a few more questions. So, actually, I'm going to follow up another question from Quinn. So they say the greater focus in Asian culture as compared to Western/American, I'm just reading here, on generational connections could make time travel fiction particularly a strong genre for Asian science fiction. Western fiction has featured time travel for a long time, going back to H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, which was well over 100 years ago. Is time travel found in Chinese science fiction and perhaps just awaiting translation? Or maybe is there an interest in creating Chinese film adaptations of Western Chinese, or rather Western time travel stories? So what's the kind of, or is there a special kind of resonance of time travel stories perhaps? Or Louis, do you know of time travel stories? Or Diane, have you heard of any that have an Asian or Asian American genesis?
Yeah, actually, time travel has become like strangely strangely popular in Chinese films. Not even in science fictions. We have these kind of fantasy films where you have like time travel, and and interesting, a lot of films are about traveling back into history. So you can be like among the emperors and stuff. But so for sci-fi, well, I'm not that a big sci-fi reader. And there are definitely, sci-fi a lot of sci-fi time travel stories. Yeah, but I think it's important to well, still, like Hollywood's influence and the great and when we think about great sci-fi writers, we think about Western writers, like especially American writers, and their influence are really strong to anyone who wants to write stories and sci-fi stories. And well, I think only one thing as great, we should definitely learn from them, but on the other thing, we should create, I think very importantly, create something of our own. And as I mentioned, Liu Cixin's three-body trilogy, I think that's a very successful attempt at creating a Chinese sci-fi story. It has historical parts, during the Cultural Revolution, something happened, and then you have the future. So I hope that answers the question.
Anything to add, Diane, before we move to the next question?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting just to see the parallels between visual media and Asian American literature, where I think, writers have been long thinking about sort of space, time, and time travel and what that might mean. And so I'm thinking of a recent poetry book written by Sally Wen Mao called Oculus, where, she goes back in time and pretends to be Anna May Wong, and just like the thoughts that go through her mind, and just also living in a digital world. And so, there are a lot of examples of just contemporary Asian American literature that I can point to that speaks to these themes more broadly.
All of our reading lists extended when we do these events, I feel like. I have so many more books to read. So this is we had two comments or two inputs from Anne. Anne, thank you. First thing Anne said that the film was awesome. So Louis, somebody else really enjoyed it. So Anne asks a kind of a long question, and but I'm gonna go ahead and just read it. So for Black Americans, she starts, there is a recent trend of historical fantasy being used to reveal and make more understood some of the horrible events that have stuck in the Black psyche and deeply impacted them, that the white community is and was largely unaware of. And I think there's been a number of TV series recently, including Lovecraft Country is the one that I'm most familiar with. But looking at the books 1491 and 1493, readers learn that Chinese people have been present in the Americas longer than is typically observed in our history, because we're often not taught Mexican and Central American or Spanish imperial history, which includes tremendous trade with China, even before the US was chartered, created. So here's the question. Would you say that long reach of Chinese history, especially on the Pacific coast of North America, is something that Chinese and Chinese diaspora writers are aware of? It seems like different understandings of history must also influence our views of the future. So Anne, that is like a dissertation prompt question. It's a very good question. I would love to hear what these two have to say about it, but I don't think we'll be able to cover the whole ground.
Yeah, so actually, yeah, I think it's a great question. Actually, no. Even so, I started learning from all these like Chinese history in the US as I was making this film. You know, I had to read something, I had to go to the museum, then I realized, oh, like there Chinese people like started, you know, they went to California and built like railways. And yeah, and it's quite a fascinating history. And also, I read a book last year called Hawaii, by James something, I forgot. It's an amazing book, and well, it's about the history of Hawaii, and there's a whole chapter dedicated to like Chinese immigrants who went to Hawaii and grew cottons, and that's also like quite amazing history. Yeah, so I wonder why is that? Why so few of us know about this? And well, I guess to us, to Chinese people, I guess it's not that like a proud part of our history, you know, like because I mean a lot of people when left China because I guess that it was poor and they were looking to make money outside, but their life in the US were pretty miserable too. So it's not a great history for us. I guess that's part of the reason why few of us knew about it.
Yeah, so I mean, as an ABC American born Chinese, right? I can say that probably most of my friends do not know the details of sort of this diasporic history. And the only reason I know is because I went to Chinese school pretty regularly and was part of the Jeopardy team. And so we would actually compete and learn, you know, like memorize these details about Chinese history and these facts about the history, but it's not in the curriculum here, right? We don't even teach Asian American studies in the curriculum. So, I mean, of course, there won't be any curriculum on diasporic histories. And so I think it might not be a lack of awareness from writers, but the fact that there just aren't that many spaces in higher education that allows us to think differently about world history and how we relate to diasporic, right, histories.
Yeah, I certainly didn't learn about this even in my AP US history class, and it took me reading Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States to even get some very, you know, that's a very broad book, but to get any light shed on the history of, for example, Chinese people, the deep history of Chinese people in North America. But that's just a starting point, of course. Thank you both, and thank you, Anne, for that really thought-provoking question. So we've just like one more minute, and then I need to I'm going to do a little outro that's a minute or two long. But so Nicholas had one more question, and I'll see what you can do in a minute, Louis. Is there symbolism in the necklace beyond a valuable piece of jewelry? And he was, you know, Nicholas is wondering what if that had a meaning beyond just being this kind of MacGuffin at the center of the story.
Actually, no. Yeah, we created it more as an essential prop that connect everything together. But yeah, I think that's a good thing about film, right? When you make a film and other people can interpret it in their own way. So I think there might be a metaphor.
So thank you both so much. I have a few little notes at the end here, and also I'm dropping into chat a bunch of web links, mostly to CSI stuff, but also to a few other things. And Louis, if you have a website or anything you'd like people to look at, please drop it in the chat also. So thank you both so much for being here with us today. This was so interesting and thrilling, and I've really enjoyed talking to you as we've prepared as well. I should also thank my colleagues at the Center for Science and the Imagination for making this event possible and for helping me shift this series for COVID times. It's been great to do it virtually this year and to do short films instead of TV shows. It's been really awesome. I'd also like to thank Storycom once again for partnering with us and allowing us to screen the film and connecting us to Louis. I wouldn't have met him otherwise. So you can learn more by following Shimmer Program on Twitter. And as I mentioned earlier, this is our last science fiction TV dinner until next fall. And stay tuned for more details about events in the fall. You can join our mailing list or follow us on social media at some of those links. In May and later in the summer, we're going to host a couple installments of our CSI Skill Tree series, which is about video games, world building, and visions of the future. The first game we're going to talk about is called In Other Waters, and it's about astrobiology and oceans. It's super interesting. So we'll be announcing the date and time of that event very soon. To find out more about the center and to sign up for our mailing list, you can visit our website, csi.asu.edu. There are links to Twitter and YouTube in the chat there, including videos of past TV dinner events and other events we've done during the Zoom times. So thank you all again so much for tuning in. Diane, Louis, thank you. This has been very educational. I'll be thinking about it a lot for the rest of the week, I'm sure. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a good day,
Thanks so much.
Louis, and a good night, Diane. And farewell, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.